started our series on justice and focusing on how God's justice actually leads to restoration. And so last week we talked about this. I need somebody to open up to Genesis 1:26 and somebody else to be ready to read Genesis 5:19 or Galatians 5. You got Galatians?
I got Genesis.
You got Genesis. Okay. All right, and I need somebody Galatians 5:19 through 24. Dude? Okay. So you got Galatians. All right, so while they're getting that, what we talked about last week was that our idea of justice, as humans, our idea of justice really centers around the idea of fairness. If I steal $20 from Kobe, then what's going to be expected of me?
To be a thief. To not give it back.
To give it back. That the law is going to require that I give him $20 back. Or the law might say I owe him more than $20, but that the focus there is that we're getting things back to where it was. Okay? In the ancient world, they had the phrase of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So if you cut off somebody's hand, you got your hand chopped off. Okay? It's kind of the same with the death penalty, right? If somebody kills somebody else, depending on the state that you live in, they're going to potentially send that person to be executed, right? What does that do to us? If we execute somebody that killed somebody else, does that bring back the victim that was killed?
No.
No. So why do we do it? Maybe.
For justice, I guess.
Yeah.
I think it's because what we think is fair.
Yeah. Yeah, and that ties into what she was saying about justice. I mean, and just our idea of justice is this idea of it's fair. You killed somebody else, so you should die. It's kind of a warped sense of justice and fairness, but that kind of gets into some of the other stuff that we were talking about last week, and that we have this idea of justice built into ourselves, that it's something that's kind of just, I guess I just said it, it's built into our own DNA. And so it's this concept of, it's something that we understand. And so it's something that we can tell. Like last week, what we did was we started off where we had Trinity and Jeff playing ping pong against each other, and every single time that Trinity either won the match or even when he didn't win the match, we just added more people to Trinity's team until it was completely stacked against him, and then we told Jeff that he had to sit there and try and play with his hand, and he couldn't even play with a paddle, because it was this idea of, the system was completely unfair and rigged against Jeff. And so, we talked about how we went to Romans 1:20 and chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. We said that, God specifically says there's no excuse for anybody to not understand how this is supposed to work. I mean, it's built into nature. As humans, our understanding of justice might move back and forth because that's how we work, but God is the same, and God doesn't change. And so justice is rooted in Him, and as such, it's built into everything in creation. It's built into ourselves. I mean, I didn't even have to explain it. Hayden Hudson tried to move to the other team last week because he was like, "This ain't right," And as soon as Trinity saw that, even when he lost, he got a benefit. He would sit there and look at me like, "This is weird," because he knew it wasn't right. And so. It's something that's built into us, and we create justice in this world by directly intervening on behalf of others. So when we see somebody else being treated unfairly, we actually create justice when we step in and speak on their behalf, just like Christ did for us. So tonight we're going to focus on the image of God. And so when we're talking about injustice, are we talking about just like if I go up to Kobe and smack him? Is that injustice?
Not really.
Why not?
Because, I mean, what do you do? So-
Did you say is that justice or injustice?
Is that injustice?
Oh,
Depends if he calls you.
Okay.
don't
Well-
excuse it.
Okay. But is it injustice? That's the question at hand.
I thought you said justice before. Injustice is the opposite, right?
Yes.
Okay, then
What is injustice? If I go over here and I just randomly smack Kobe,
Someone doing what they want, getting away with it.
yes. Okay. And it's more than just being mean. Okay. It's using your position and power to push somebody else down. Okay. It's the idea of oppressing those who are lower than yourself. Okay. Or even rigging the system to an extent so that you can push them down lower than yourself, and you continue to do that. Okay. So what are some ways that people treat other people unjustly?
Like some teachers, if the students correct them, they'll just completely ignore the students thinking that they're smarter because they're grown-ups and we're not as smart because we're kids.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes in a school situation there might be a unjust system working. What else?
Politics.
Politics. Definitely in politics.
yeah, Kobe.
What are some examples in politics of things that are unjust?
Oh, oh.
I mean, there's two sides, really, and so, I mean,
It just depends on what you believe.
What do you mean?
back it up.
Your choice like if they have a bunch of power and they want to stay in power, so they make laws against it,
Okay.
so that they can just keep it.
So manipulating the laws.
Sure.
Sure.
If a president is somehow getting away with somehow having to follow the law.
Okay.
Like a lot of people don't like the electoral college.
Say what?
The electoral.
Oh, electoral college. Yeah.
A lot of people think that's unjust
Yeah.
because sometimes it doesn't represent what the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a tricky situation with that one. What else? What are some other examples that you guys can think of unjust? How people treat each other unjustly?
Bullies.
Bullies.
Sure.
Okay.
People that think they're bigger than others.
Sometimes they are bigger.
So quiet in here.
And it's too quiet.
Almost sounds like a library.
All right. Any others? It doesn't just have to be from today's culture. You can, if you can think of something, an example in the Bible or whatever.
Example in the past.
Sure.
Racism. Technically, that's still back in the past.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Yeah.
In the past, the president probably future.
Yeah. Yeah, and what are some examples of how racism has been unjust?
To the point where they would have separate bathrooms for colored people.
Yeah. The whole separate but equal thing, right?
These people are going to a completely different place that's low quality, but it's equal.
Right. I think we were just talking about this the other day where or last week it might have been where for the longest time black people didn't have any rights, and then even after the law was passed where black people could vote, they still rigged the system so that they couldn't get in there and vote.
Like that one movie?
Free State of Jones?
No.
Oh, okay.
But like the black guy goes in there, the older, and then he tries to vote, but they say like, if you can't read, you can't vote, but he was just making that up, it's not a law.
Okay.
And then like, they finally taught him. This is a good movie.
Yeah, I don't know which one that is, but there's a similar scene. If you guys watch the movie Free State of Jones with Matthew McConaughey, I think golly, my allergies are going nuts today. If you guys watch that movie, there's probably some language and some other stuff, but there's a lot of stuff that goes on in there. In fact, Matthew McConaughey actually becomes this guy that stands up for against this injustice because at one point after they're allowed to vote, he goes in there with a whole bunch of black people and says, "No, you're going to allow them to vote," and he actually stays there and makes sure that they can get in there and cast their ballot. Now, at the end of the day, they still rigged the system, and they still sat there and just basically ignored their votes. But racism is a big one to exemplify injustice in our world today. Can you guys think of any others?
Liars.
What?
There you go.
What?
Life is unfair, it's unjust.
Life itself is unfair and unjust. Okay. What were you gonna say?
Oh, I was gonna say there was a point of time when women couldn't vote.
Yeah,
So
that's
that
true.
Was an injustice.
And I mean, even though women can vote now, I mean, there's still a system kind of rigged against women to a certain extent, isn't there? I mean, if you guys watch the news, you'll see like it's coming up a lot lately where they're showing how I mean, it's one thing when a person's skills are actually lower than somebody else's. Like, for example, if somebody was to pay Aiden and I for welding, it would be natural to pay Aiden more for welding than me because I know nothing about the topic, and Aiden does, and Aiden would do a wonderful job with it. But the problem is that in some circumstances, what they might do is simply because the system doesn't really favor, let's say in Aiden's circumstance, let's say the system didn't favor Aiden, even though I wasn't as skilled, they'd still pay me more. Is that right? To pay me more even though I don't know as much? No. And that's kind of the stuff that we're talking about here. That's basically sexism.
It's
Okay.
called Murder in Mississippi.
Okay, I'll have to watch that one. I hadn't seen that one.
Yeah, they like people from the north try to go down and help them get the right to vote, and they end up getting killed. That's a true story. They're Jewish.
Okay.
Yeah, and they were racist against them too.
Okay.
But it's like you said, it's very great movie.
Yeah.
We watched it in school, so.
I'm sure they had some way of like bleeping and stuff out or whatever.
Yeah.
Murder in Mississippi, I think is what he said. Okay, so we've talked about different ways that people treat others unfairly, unjustly. So that brings up the question of why. Why do people treat each other like that?
Make them feel better.
Make themselves feel better?
Yes.
Okay.
That's it.
What else? Yeah,
Because they're having a bad day.
I can see that. Yeah.
And they want others to feel the same.
Okay. Yeah.
Sometimes they just want to feel powerful.
Yeah. Some people do. Some people definitely just they get that position of authority and they're like, I like this, and they don't want anybody else to have it, right? How does it happen? Like how do people get authority in the first place?
Punch someone in the face.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Maybe they think differently.
Think differently.
Getting everyone to be on your side.
Getting everyone to be on your side. Okay, yeah. Were you gonna say something?
Sometimes they just work hard.
Yeah, sometimes.
So when they finally get up there, they kind of slack off.
Okay. What are some other ways that people get power?
Get bit by a spider.
Bit by a spider.
They become intimidating.
Okay.
Like tall.
So yeah, sometimes it's just bigger and stronger.
Okay. What about when people get elected?
Oh.
Okay. How did like the whole system, like in England and all that, you had the feudal system get set up. How did all that come about in the first place?
That's a good question.
Human.
Just humans. Okay. So we talked about this when we mentioned like the word Lord and how that term really came about. If you guys remember, in feudal England, you'd have like a piece of property, right? You'd have the Lord of that area, and he'd have his territory or whatever, and then you have the different farmers surrounding it, right? And they basically made a deal because they couldn't afford to protect themselves. So they would sit there and say to this guy, you have, power. You've got you've got the ability to protect us. You have the means to build weapons and all this other different stuff and whatever. We will serve you if you protect us in case somebody tries to raid. And so that's kind of how that whole system got built up. Okay. Sometimes it was just like you guys said. Sometimes it's just people had the strength or whatever to do it. If you guys actually go into Genesis and you go into the account after the flood, and it's talking about the different people that show up. At one point, you read about a guy named Nimrod. Sounds really weird now, but Nimrod is actually a big conqueror in the ancient days before Abraham shows up. And if you read about it and you recognize the names, Nimrod is actually the first empire builder of his time, because he conquers the area that becomes Babylon and he establishes that. He goes off and he conquers and establishes the area that becomes Assyria and several other different regions there. Nimrod's a powerful guy. It's a funny name in our time and culture, but at that point in time, he would have been pretty feared. Okay? Why? Because he was powerful. Because he marched in and took what he wanted. All right?
Nowadays, if he walks around somebody, he'd be laughed at.
Yeah. Yeah. For that name, yes, he would be today. What about Cain? Right? He was jealous, so he kills his brother, right?
Yes.
So after that, in the story of the history of people, it gets down to, one of Lamech's one of Cain's descendants named Lamech, right? And Lamech goes to talk to his wives, and what does he say? He says, hey, come here. Okay, so you guys know the curse on Cain, right? That if anybody harms Cain, what's going to happen to him?
I think they'll either die or be cursed.
Yeah, it's like they get 7 times worth of punishment. So, it's like this idea of a complete punishment is going to be upon them if they hurt Cain. And so Lamech, says, hey, so Cain killed somebody and he got 7 times worth of punishment. Somebody was going to be punished 7 times for hurting him. I killed the man just because he slighted me. So the punishment for me is going to be 70 times that. He's reveling in the fact that he's evil, essentially. Yeah, it's stupid and weird. But that's the whole idea, is that, Lamech is somebody that is powerful and does what he wants. Okay? So let's go ahead and read Genesis 1:26. Kobe, was that you?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go ahead and read from that.
Okay. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.
All right. I'm going to need to lift this up real quick. When we're talking about image of God, what are we talking about?
Be like him. No.
How we look.
Singular.
Maybe how he acts.
How he acts. Okay. So it's similar. What else?
power that we have.
Power that we have. How so?
Like, just like God has the power to create things, we have the power to create things too, just not out of nothing.
Yeah. And if we have time, I've got a video on the idea of the image of God that we can watch. But they bring that up. Yeah, the very idea that God gives us the ability to create. So yeah. Anything else? Okay. Yeah. So when we're talking about the image of God, we're not really talking about physical characteristics necessarily. Okay. I mean, if we meant that, then every single one of us should look exactly the same, but we don't. We look very different from each other. Okay. Jim, go ahead and read Galatians 5:19-24.
The acts of the flesh are obvious, such as immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, wrath, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissension, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this without knowing the will of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Those who belong to the Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires.
So when we're talking about the image of being made in God's image, we're talking more about the nature of God, right? The characteristics of God. We're really gonna do this again?
I didn't do anything.
You're giving me that look of I'm gonna cause mischief.
What are you looking at me? I'm just smiling. She's the one causing the issue.
All right. So when we were made in the garden, was there anything wrong with us before the fall? No. It's after the fall that we start to experience the sinful nature. Okay? And that the sinful nature is the stuff that Jacob was reading about in verses 19-21. Okay? And so, but when we're baptized into Christ, that sinful nature, we're offered forgiveness, and we're starting to transform away from the sinful nature and into God's holy nature. All right? And so that's when we start to transform ourselves into the fruits of the Spirit, as we were just reading about: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, temperance, self-control. And there's more there as well, but when we go through that process, we're being made into more and more into God's image once again. Okay? And so being made in God's image means that we're all equal. So if we recognize the fact that every single person around us is made in God's image, is a child of God that He loves, and that we're equal, how is that going to affect the way that we treat other people? Yeah. Because if I'm going to be a bully, if I'm going to go up to Kobe and start shoving him around, but I sit there and remember the fact that he's a child of God, that God loves him, and that this is the image of God right here, I'm going to have a harder time being mean to Kobe, aren't I? And that's the whole idea, is that if we're going to see people as the image of God, then it's going to affect the way that we see justice towards others. And it's also going to affect the way that it has us look at other people that are being treated unjustly, right? If Aiden sees Brianna being treated unjustly, Like somebody is just like consistently oppressing her, just mistreating her constantly to keep her down, and in a way that she can't help herself. For example, let's say Brianna, this is later on in life, and Brianna finds herself in a position where she cannot make ends meet. Okay? And it's not just that Brianna isn't working, it's that Brianna is working, but people are sitting there and cheating her in such a way that she can't keep any funds for herself to make ends meet. And so now somebody is sitting there and saying, let's say her landlord is sitting there and saying, you know what, you didn't sign the contract, so I'm going to sit there and just raise your rent. And you can't defend yourself right now because you were in a desperate situation when you got here and you didn't sign a contract. You just decided to show up. So because there's no contract, I can raise your rent. And this consistently happens to the point where Brianna can't take care of herself anymore. She's about ready to lose her apartment because she can't afford it. If Aiden sees this, and Aiden knows that she is a child of God, then the way that he sees her because of that is going to influence Aiden to say, this is not right. You can't treat somebody like that. It goes beyond just being able to say, you can't treat other people like that. It's you can't treat a child of God like that. That's wrong. It's not right. And so in order to treat others with justice, we have to see them as God sees them, as His creation made in His image.
I should buy competition then.
Probably. All right.
Very good.
Let's see. We've got a couple minutes here, and this video is only like 5 minutes long, so I'm going to go ahead and play this because it does a really good job of talking about the whole image of God thing. I hope so. Yay!
So if you lived in ancient Bible times, odds are you lived under the authority of a king.
And many of these kings claimed that they were gods, and they would even call themselves the image of God.
Meaning they had authority to tell people what to do, order things to be made.
Yeah, they got to define good and evil. And these kings would often make statues of themselves, which in Hebrew were called tselem, often translated as idol or image.
But for Israel, they didn't view their kings as the God. In fact, they were never supposed to even make images of God.
It's exactly right, and that was really unique for that time and culture. This is rooted, first of all, in Israel's belief that you can't reduce the Creator God down to any one thing in creation. But there's another reason. People aren't to make images of God because God has already made images of Himself.
When did He do that?
Well, let's go to page 1 of the Bible. And the first person we meet there is God. He's the one with authority over all creation. He speaks and creation obeys. And He defines what is good and not good. In other words, He alone is king. But then surprisingly, as the pinnacle of all of God's creative work, He makes humans. And He calls all of them the image of God.
So He gives all humans the authority to rule.
Exactly, that's what He goes on to say. He tells the humans to subdue the earth and to rule it. And so this task that once belonged only to elite kings is here in the Bible the task of every human being. This was a revolutionary statement in its day because all humans are being called to rule and to participate in the human project.
So what does this mean? I mean, how are we all supposed to rule?
So the picture we get in Genesis is gardening.
Gardening?
Yes, gardening. So they rule the earth by cultivating it, by harnessing all of the earth's raw potential and then making something more and new out of it.
So growing food for each other.
Yes, but that also includes growing families then, which become neighborhoods, and then they create communities where people are going to work and take care of each other and build businesses and cities that will expand to new places and so on.
So ruling is really the day-to-day acts of our work and creativity.
Yes, we take the world somewhere. This is humanity's divine and sacred task.
Yeah, this all sounds really nice. And humans have designed some pretty great things. But just as often we create things that cause a lot of suffering and a lot of injustice, So maybe we shouldn't actually be ruling.
Yeah, so the Bible addresses this. In Genesis, what happens is that God gives humans a choice about how they're going to rule. So are they going to use their authority for the benefit of others, which is God's definition of good, or are they going to turn away and define good and evil for themselves and use their authority for self-advantage?
And in the story, they choose to define good and evil on their own terms.
And so this is the Bible's depiction of the human condition. So sometimes we pull off amazingly good stuff, but just as often, despite our best intentions, we act selfishly and we create evil.
And so we're stuck as mediocre rulers making a mess of things.
But that's not the end of the story. So the Bible goes on and it makes this claim that all of this was resolved when God bound himself to humanity through Jesus. And he showed us what it looks like to truly rule as a human.
So what does it look like?
Well, Jesus ruled by serving and by seeking the best for others, by putting himself underneath them and loving not just his friends, but also his enemies.
And that's not a typical way to rule.
And not only that, Jesus confronted the consequences of all the evil and the death that we have created by our messed up ways of ruling. And he takes it. I mean, he lets it kill him. And so when the New Testament writers look back to Jesus' resurrection, they see a whole new future opening up for all humanity.
Jesus is a new way to be human.
Yeah, that's why they call Jesus the image of God, or the new human. And not only that, they also believe that Jesus' divine life and power is now available to heal and to transform us to become our life and power.
And this sounds really nice, but what does it really look like?
So practically, the Apostle Paul said it looks like people being filled by Jesus' own presence and spirit, filled with love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and integrity and gentleness and self-control. He says this is the new humanity that God wants to create in us so that we become people in whom God's image is being restored, people who will move the human project forward. And that's actually how the story of the Bible ends. It's a renewed world where God is on his throne and his servants are all around him, but they're the ones ruling over this new world, taking it into new, uncharted territory with Jesus as their healer and their guide.
I love these videos.
Yep.
It's so cute.
They're pretty awesome.
Hey. It's in timeout.
Yeah.
If everyone serves everyone, then no one will be serving anyone because everyone will learn to serve each other. And it would be really confusing. Very good.
Alright. Get some info like real quick. Okay. So next week we'll continue in our series on injustice or justice. And we'll go from there. So Sunday we've got Sweetheart Banquet planning here at the building. It's just gonna be right after evening worship. I don't have your mom's phone number, so I'm trying to get all the parents there. So if you want to talk to her tonight, and just ask her to be there. Yep, your parents are gonna be there. I got something special planned. So.
It's gonna be really messy.
Are we getting tired of this?
No.
Alright.
That actually
Oh.
happens, I apologize.
Oh, okay, so that actually, I'm glad you mentioned paintball because it's separate, but anyways. So the part of the plan in April was to go to Hobbs for the youth rally. I was checking in with Lance, and he's actually not doing that this year. So we're gonna have to change gears that weekend and do something else. Okay. Well, I've got paintball on the schedule already for May.
I've never done paintball.
Wear padded clothing. Do it. Okay. So we'll figure out something else for that weekend as far as what to do. But yeah. And so the idea is on Sunday we're going to do the planning for it. Tammy's going to have a list of options for us to choose from as far as what we're going to make and serve, and we'll figure out kind of like we did last year about who's going to do what who's gonna be serving and doing whatever other roles that we have. The Sunday after that, we're gonna try and do some of the prep work, okay? So like, we'll get the invitations, put together. We might do some baking. I think if we bake some brownies, we can stick them in the freezer and they'll be okay for by February 11th when we actually do this. And if there's any other preparation work that we can do that night, then we'll do it then. So, aside from that, that's all I got. Love you guys. You're awesome.
We know.
Good. You should know that you're awesome.
You're just reminding me.